You are listening to episode 34, part 2 of this 2-episode series on the current state of ketogenic diets for cycling performance, the future of elite endurance sport, with Professor Louise Burke from the Australian Catholic University, where we will be picking up where we left off in part 1, where we talked about the current state of diet wars associated with the ketogenic diets, the concept of metabolic flexibility, increased oxygen cost of exercise while on a ketogenic diet, and many other interesting findings from Professor Louise's own research with elite racewalkers. So if for any reason you just came across this episode 34, I would strongly advise you to listen to episode 33 first, so you can listen to this talk in a chronological order. Welcome to Fuel the Pedal Podcast. And here we are again. Welcome back to Fuel the Pedal Podcast, and thank you so much for tuning in, whether you're running, cycling, driving, or just relaxing while listening to this episode. As you probably noticed, yes, I am still your host, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese nutritionist broadcasting from Madrid and fighting the good fight by providing a loudspeaker to researchers who have been giving significant contributions to the area of sports nutrition with direct applicability and relevance to cycling and other endurance sports. Today we are at episode 34, where we will resume our talk with the one and only Dr. Louise Burke, an episode which I think it was somehow to be expected that it would be popular for obvious reasons, not just by the topic itself, but for what Dr. Louise represents to all of us in this area. But I must confess that I didn't expect to receive such good feedback from everyone really, and to confirm by some of your comments, story mentions and retweets what I was really looking for with this episode, which really was to provide a balanced, open-minded and moderate approach to a sensitive topic that has been generating so many radical positions and factions, if you will, through social media. So for all of you who have been reaching out via direct messages through social media, email, by posting a story on Instagram, retweeting it on Twitter, my deepest thanks to all of you, and hopefully this part 2 will be even more stimulating, useful, and ultimately contribute to just disseminate a more balanced vision on this topic. And I mean not excluding completely the applicability of ketogenic diets in endurance sports, but certainly, and I mean certainly, not putting them on a pedestal or believing fiercely that they are the cure for all evil. And that's exactly what Dr. Louise has done brilliantly on part 1, and I can assure you that she will continue to do so on part 2 as well. And if you've listened to part 1, that's exactly where we left off. I was asking Dr. Louise if she considered if there is any particular context for the use of a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet throughout a season of an endurance athlete. In addition to this, today we will be talking about some novel areas within this topic, such as how is the oral microbiome affected by a ketogenic diet, its impact on bone metabolism, and even the supplementation with exogenous ketones, which, as many of you know, especially those of you who have listened to episode 12, is a recurrent topic in road cycling. But just before we dive into today's episode, allow me to just share with you an undergoing study looking for volunteers. And this one was sent by Stefano Montanari, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and he is a PhD student working at Chichester University, and he and his research group are recruiting cyclists and triathletes, both males and females, to test 2 New Zealand blackcurrant-based products. And it's a study in which you can participate comfortably from home if you have a turbo trainer with access to Zwift. For those of you who don't know, Zwift is a multiplayer online cycling and running physical training program that enables users to interact, train, and compete in a virtual world. And it's a platform that has been around for a while, but this year with the COVID-19 lockdown, it has become not only a way for pro and amateur riders to keep on training and simulate competitions, but apparently it has been increasingly used for research purposes as well, perhaps as a way of achieving larger sample sizes and increase adherence. So if you want to participate in Stefano's study, you just have to send an email to home nzbcproject@chi.ac.uk. Don't bother memorizing it. I will put everything on this episode show notes where I'll be providing all the info you need. And again, if you want to promote your research here on Fuel the Pedal, just reach out and I'll be happy to lend a hand. And I am mentioning this in September 2020, so if you're listening to this far into the future, which I hope so, bear in mind that the recruitment period is probably over. And let me think if I can bother you with anything else before we start. Yeah, one last thing, I promise. So I usually don't often mention here on the podcast other projects I'm involved or opinion articles I write, but this one was very personal and special to me. I write a monthly article to PEZ Cycling News, that is PEZ Cycling News, a Canadian online cycling website, and the topics pretty much vary according to what's relevant at a particular moment, from COVID to exogenous ketones to nutrition for Zwift training, but the last one was motivated by a personal endeavor I attempted this summer, an Everesting challenge which fortunately ended up successfully. So this past month's article was precisely about my experience and nutritional planning for this challenge, and I'll tell you in a moment why I am bringing this up. So the concept of Everesting is really simple. Pick any hill anywhere on the planet and repeat it up and down in a single activity until you reach the vertical altitude of Mount Everest. That would be 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet. As you can imagine, this is a tremendous physical and psychological effort that requires a lot of careful planning and logistic considerations. And believe me, I'm not mentioning this to brag about it or let you know that I did it. The main reason really is that I'm worried about the growing number of amateur cyclists who engage into this type of ultra-endurance events with no idea of how to plan for it in terms of nutrition, what types of foods, how many grams of carbohydrate per hour, fluid needs, gastrointestinal comfort, and logistics behind it. And this is an event that can easily last from 9 to 17 hours depending on how you decide to take it. And there's not much research to base our strategies on. So my motivation to write this article and to mention it here on the podcast before getting into today's episode really is to, number one, to share with you my experience and give you some foundation if you are attempting or working with an athlete who is looking to give it a try. There is an infographic accompanying the article to make things more visual. Number two, to motivate you to carefully plan or at least to consult with a trained dietitian, nutritionist before attempting it. And number three, to somehow inspire researchers to provide data on this type of trending ultra-endurance events. And I understand that there are major limitations in logistics and it's not really feasible to have a group of people performing an Everesting as a part of a research protocol, but some observational case studies, for example, with relevant comments to it, could gradually bring us closer to have more data on this type of events and help us dietitians or nutritionists do our job. So the link for that article will be available on the show notes for this episode 34, or you can simply go to PEZ Cycling News, that would be PEZ Cycling News, and check under Toolbox Articles. And now, finally, the moment you've been waiting for and the reason you've clicked on this episode on your phone. Let us resume part 2, ketogenic diets for cycling performance. Are they the future of elite endurance sport? With Professor Louise Burke, up next on, well, you know where, on Fuel the Pedal podcast. Enjoy. So, given everything that you've been presenting here so far regarding increased fat oxidation but impaired carbohydrate oxidation and decreased exercise economy, which at least in a competitive scenario can translate into decreased performance, do you consider that there is any particular context for the use of low-carb, high-fat diets throughout the season of an endurance athlete, perhaps as part of a periodized approach to maximize certain training adaptations, or whether in ultra-endurance events where intensity is lower, or even as a short-term strategy to promote fat loss in an athlete?
Well, look, I think the ultra-endurance area is the most promising, and if you sort of think about what might happen in that event where you want to be more fat reliant, there's no need to have higher intensity sort of parts of competitive success, and where there may be some practical reasons where it's difficult to take in enough carbohydrate if that is the fuel source you're wanting to be more reliant on, then yes, I think the ketogenic diet approach, could be quite useful. I haven't thought of using it in a different way or a periodized way for the competitive athletes that I work with, because I sort of feel that their ability to periodize and have periods of low carbohydrate availability for training is better achieved in sort of smaller amounts over the week, and it doesn't require a ketogenic diet to do that. We certainly we certainly include some trainings low carbohydrate availability at different times with both cyclists and marathon runners and race walkers that I work with, but we haven't really seen, or I haven't considered a need to do a ketogenic diet to achieve the benefits in terms of improving fat oxidation. It's certainly a side effect of the volume of training and the ability to just have much shorter periods of low carbohydrate availability included in training. There's plenty of other sort of adaptation periods that the athletes that I work with also do in terms of altitude training or heat acclimatization, etc. So trying to fit all that into the competitive year is often very difficult, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I haven't thought about putting in ketogenic diets as a specific adaptation in its own right. One of the other things to think about is, really athletes need to work back from the events that they're preparing for so that they understand what their event characteristics are and what is going to require in them to be successful, and to recognise that even within a team or within a single race, that there can be different approaches to that. And of course in cycling we've got different roles of the different riders within the team and what they need to achieve. So there's different approaches I could imagine for different kinds of cyclists, even when they're doing the same races. But often what people don't understand is that, particularly if you're dealing with not just the highest level athletes, that even when you think you're doing the same event, it's quite different. I run marathons, and when I run a marathon, it's quite different from Kipchoge running a marathon, because he does his in 2 hours and I do mine in 3.5, and so we're really doing a different race. What I'm doing is more close to the 50k race walking event that I work with athletes, rather than a marathon runner, because my absolute speed to cover 26 miles is much slower, and so I am dealing with a different physiological event, even though I can be doing it on the same day as Kipchoge. So it's only when you work really closely with sport that you probably get this more intricate appreciation of the complexity of what you're doing, and then you can work backwards to think, well, what is it that I need to be able to do with my event, my contribution to that event, and my physiology to get the best for myself on the day.
Oh, absolutely. And that is one of the problems right there with choosing sides and saying this as black or white, going keto or to stuff yourself with carbohydrates. There are indeed different shades of gray here. The training status is to be considered, as you've mentioned as well, and the intensity at which you are training or competing. So the periodized approach with some meals or days with a low carbohydrate availability, depending on the intensity of the upcoming training session, appears to be the most beneficial for promoting these adaptations, while also fueling high-intensity training sessions. But the ultra-endurance field really is an interesting field to look out for in terms of seeing what approaches might or might not be beneficial. So now that we've pretty much highlighted for the listeners the limitations, but also the scenarios in which you believe that a low-carb, high-fat ketogenic diet could be useful, we can dig into some novel data regarding the effects of following a ketogenic diet on the oral microbiome of elite endurance athletes and its effect on bone metabolism. So let's start with the effects on the oral microbiome. We just had on the podcast Professor Andrew Jones on a previous episode talking about the obvious topic, which was dietary nitrates and endurance performance. And we've also touched on this topic of how a ketogenic diet, as some of your research shows, could affect the oral microbiome of elite endurance athletes, in particular in knocking out some of the bacteria responsible for the reduction of nitrate to nitrate nitrate, which is an essential process when ingesting, for example, beetroot juice to enhance performance in endurance athletes. So what can you tell us about the implications these findings may have for endurance athletes taking nitrates to enhance performance while on a ketogenic diet?
Sure. So let me just go back one step and say that when we did our first studies, we spent an awful lot of time and money setting up the protocol so that we decided that we would look at as many things as possible and consider that there might be things other than performance that could be going on if people are on a ketogenic diet. And of course, such an extreme dietary change we thought would have an effect on the microbiome. So we collected samples of stools so we could get what was happening with the gut microbiome. But I suddenly had a thought, well, maybe we should also look at what's happening in the mouth. And when I did it, I was sort of thinking more of the idea that if we took all the sugar out of the diet, then it might have a sort of a positive effect on the oral microbiome in terms of dental decay. So we collected the samples and sent them off to some colleagues who are experts with the microbiome. And it takes quite a while to do that sort of analysis, so we sort of didn't get immediate results back. And when we did, our colleagues pointed out some changes in the oral microbiome with the ketogenic diet, and they pointed to a couple of different varieties of bacteria. And when I looked at them, I thought, gosh, I think I've heard of those before. And I went back and had a look at some of the papers from Andy Van Hatelo and Andy Jones, which said these were the important bacteria in the mouth for reducing the nitrate to nitrite, as you said. And they're an essential part of that whole role of nitrate as a source of nitric oxide and an alternative pathway for the production of nitric oxide that has now become quite famous in sports nutrition. So I rang Andy and said, look, we've got some pretty funny results. I hadn't thought about this, but we seem to have knocked out some of the useful bacteria in your mouth. What do you think might happen as a result? And Andy said, oh, well, you've just answered a question for us, because they had done a study on the effects of beetroot juice supplementation on a very short exposure to a high-fat diet. And their theory was that if we had seen a reduction in exercise economy with the high-fat diet, then perhaps using beetroot juice, which is known to increase or improve exercise economy, that might sort of cancel out that negative. And when they had done that little experiment, they hadn't seen anything as a result that supported their hypothesis. And in fact, when they had a look at the plasma levels of nitrite in the study, they found that after exposure to the high-fat diet, they didn't see a reduction of the nitrate that was consumed into the nitrite. So the effectiveness of the beetroot juice was knocked out, if you like. And so they hadn't quite worked out what was causing this problem, but we'd answered it from another direction. So in the last supernova study, we have collaborated and we have gone back and joined up the dots by looking at what happens when our keto-adapted athletes consume beetroot juice as a nitrate supplement. And we're working with Andy. Hopefully his lab will get back into production again once the COVID restrictions are taken away in Exeter, and we'll all sit round and wait with bated breath till we see whether our hypothesis is right, because what we think we'll see is that the beetroot juice no longer is effective in that you can consume it, but you don't get that conversion to nitrite, which then allows the nitric oxide production to occur. And so that might mean that the background level of nitrate production or nitric oxide production in ketogenic diets might be reduced, and also their ability to use beetroot juice as a supplement might also be impaired. So maybe if you can ask me in 6 months' time, either ask me or ask Andy, we'll have the results for you.
Well, I'll make sure to ask you both in 6 months or perhaps update this topic on an upcoming podcast. But I can't help but notice the irony in this. So the one supplement that could perhaps be most interesting for athletes undergoing a ketogenic diet to counteract the effects of increased oxygen cost of exercise is actually the one whose effects get compromised with just 3 weeks of ketogenic dieting, right?
Yes, well, that's what we'll wait and see. And it just goes to show that you can always... it's important to think laterally when you're doing some sort of investigation that, sometimes you're so focused on one theory that you mightn't have room for thinking about these other serendipitous outcomes that occur. So that was a lucky finding for us. And you're right. Andy had obviously thought it was a way in which we could have attenuated the problem that we saw with the ketogenic diet in the first studies, but it doesn't seem to be the way to go. So we'll wait until we can find all the dots being joined up before we are really sure about that hypothesis. But at this stage, it does seem that the nitrate story, both in terms of the general dietary nitric oxide production from nitrate as well as the responsiveness to the beetroot juice, might be a problem with the keto diet.
Looking forward to see that research come out, but it's really interesting to see that a dietary change such as this can produce changes in the oral microbiome, and that by itself can then condition other digestive or metabolic processes. And from the oral microbiome, we now travel to the bone to talk about the emerging evidence regarding the effects of following a ketogenic diet on bone health, a research you've performed with elite racewalkers that even deserved a piece on the New York Times. And again, the comments were as expected, with many low-carb ketogenic advocates immediately jumping in and criticizing on the comment section in the New York piece. Anyway, I'm really interested in having you explain the main findings of this research regarding the effects of ketogenic diet on bone metabolism, and I would also make this more applied to cycling. And we are talking about a group of athletes who are at a high risk for bone injuries due to unfortunate crashes, mostly during racing. And if you're following the Tour de France now, there have been already a whole lot of these unfortunate events. So I think we can all assume that it is very unlikely that a certain dietary approach can protect cyclists or make them more vulnerable to breaking a collarbone, for example. They will break it either way. But since you observed some impairment in markers of bone modeling and remodeling, could there be some other implications for these athletes?
Great question. Let's just start with cycling first. So we know that most of the cycling exercises are non-weight bearing type of exercise, so it doesn't have the positive effect on bone that you see with other types of sport. And there are other things that cyclists do that seem to exacerbate the problems with bone health. The low energy availability is one aspect, because we know how athletes or cyclists often restrict energy intake to get to that really lean form that has become part of elite cycling. And also just the fact that when they ride, it's not just the fact that they're not weight-bearing. When you're in an aerodynamic position on a bike, you're actually unloading your spine. So there's a whole lot of risk factors there that aren't too great for bone. Whether that is part of the reason for injuries when cyclists come off their bikes and have collarbone crushes, etc., it's probably being a little bit exaggerating, I think, to say that bone health is having a major role there, because I think, if you fall off a bike when you're going at 70 miles an hour down a hill, you're going to break a bone regardless of how strong the bone is.
Sure. But
there may be some effect on, how well the bone knits and heals, etc. Mm-hmm. And there may be some other effects on other soft tissues or other cartilage and other tissues that are going to have the same effects as what we'll speak about now. So in both our Supernova 1 and 2 studies, we were interested to have a look at the interactive effects of the diet on a session of exercise. And the reason that we directed our focus to that was that we had previously measured a major increase in the IL-6 response to exercise in the ketogenic diet group. And this is a cytokine which has both a pro and an anti-inflammatory response. So we're not quite sure what the role it was having when it was elevated post-exercise with the ketogenic diet was. But other people's work, particularly from Craig Sale and his wife Kirsty had shown in other models that when IL-6 is elevated post-exercise, it doesn't have a very good effect on the acute measures of bone metabolism. It increases the CTX response, which is one of the bone markers that shows bone breakdown, and it can have an effect on reducing the P1NP bone marker of bone formation. And so given that this had been seen in other models where exercise was done with low carbohydrate availability, we thought it was worth having a look to see whether persistent low energy availability around exercise also had that effect. And it wasn't just based on the acute markers of bone metabolism that we had some kind of clue that something might be happening, because if you look in the literature, there's some studies with mice and rats that show a ketogenic diet has negative effects on bone. And also, if you look at populations like children with intractable epilepsy who are put on ketogenic diets to control that, they often have very poor bone health. Now, there's obviously some problems with directly applying those pieces of evidence, because those children with the epilepsy often have mobility problems, and they were often also on lots of medication which may have effects on bone. But there was enough interest, we thought, to justify the investigation. And what we did find is that with our exercise session, which was a 25k walking session, around about 2 hours of moderately to high intensity sustained exercise, we saw an increase in the IL-6 response to that in the ketogenic diet group compared to their baseline tests when they're on high carbohydrate diets, and also compared to the group that was continuing to be on carbohydrate-supported exercise. And we saw those changes in the bone markers. So there was an increase in the CTX, which is the bone breakdown marker, and a reduction in the bone formation marker. And when you looked at the ratio between those two markers, it was quite a dramatic pull towards what you would imagine would be greater bone breakdown. And that was during exercise and in the couple of hours of recovery after the exercise session. So it's a very acute marker. We don't say that it's showing that there is an impairment of bone health, but we show that that certainly isn't moving in the direction that would suggest that bone is getting a lot of support during the session and in the recovery phase. And it does, I think, at least justify that further studies should be done. And that might mean looking at people who've been on much longer term ketogenic diets to see what their response to exercise is, and then following the bone health of athletes that have been on ketogenic diets for a long period. It's often difficult just looking at cross-sectional data because you can't compare just the effect of the ketogenic diet if you're looking at two groups of athletes. Looking at their long-term bone health, there's lots of other factors that go into play with bone metabolism and bone health. But it would be good if we've got studies of people who are doing very long-term ketogenic diets, or opportunities to look at those cross-sectional studies and keep adding to the data to see whether there's any long-term problem that we need to take into account.
Well, I think that idea was left quite clear in your paper, and as you say, we need those longer-term studies to see what would happen, but still this is an important indicator to consider. And I would still ask you this, while understanding what you said regarding the complexity of this matter, and it's perhaps too early to draw conclusions, but do you believe, or is there any data to show that the inclusion of load-bearing exercises or high-impact exercises could somehow protect or at least attenuate the impairment observed in these markers?
Well, look, this is a very complicated area to get to the bottom of bone health, because bone obviously responds to weight-bearing exercise to try and strengthen itself. But on the other hand, if the load that's being put on that bone, even if it is strengthening through the load-bearing effect, is still too great, you'll have problems with stress fractures or actual fractures if the weight is greater than the bone can carry. And of course, there's so many other factors that go into bone health. There's genetics, there's vitamin D, there's all sorts of other things. So it's hard to just take one factor on its own and say that's the way of being able to help or harm the bone. We'll need a little bit more work, I think, before we can get to the bottom line of what the take-home message could be there.
Sure, it's definitely complex, so we better move on to the next question. And I think it's inevitable to ask this question because more than the results published on the papers, you've dealt directly with the athletes involved in all these supernova studies, and they were able to experience firsthand the effects of all these protocols, dietary approaches, and you got to witness them and obtain their feedback on it after the studies, and that I think it's even more interesting. And listeners are probably aware of the mediatized case of Evan Dunphy, the Canadian race walker who took part in the supernova studies and then went on to have a very successful season. So what sort of feedback did you get from the athletes themselves after undergoing all the experiments and trying the different diets? Because as I understand, they got to choose which diet to follow, so perhaps they had some previous expectations. So I'm really curious to know the further developments from it.
Look, you've got a lot of good questions in there, so I'll try and unpack them one by one. The first thing is the comment about how we set up our studies. And yes, because we can't blind the diets, we have to then take into account when we're trying to measure performance that there will be a placebo effect. And then if we assign the participants into the diet groups randomly or do it in the way that you'd set up as an ideal study protocol, then you'll have the problem that you might have athletes in a group or in a dietary intervention that they fear or they don't really feel is the best for them. So the way that we've tried to get round the need to measure performance as well as possible is that we give all our subjects the information and ask them what they think they'd like to try, whether they've got some ideas, whether they've had some previous experiences, whether they're just interested, and try and match them up with a dietary intervention that they really want to believe in. And so in the first study that we did, because the keto diet was just new at that stage, there was a lot of interest. And if you have a look at our results, you'll see that at baseline, the group that asked to try the ketogenic diet were the better athletes. They were, really wanting to see if there's anything in it for them. And the next comment I'll make is it's an interesting phenomenon these days. When you're doing a study, you have to go through ethics approval, and during the ethics process, you tell the ethics group, the panel, that you're going to anonymise all the results, and that when you present all your data, that it's always going to be group data, so that no individual athlete's results will be identifiable, and that's to protect the participants. But these days, you'll find that your participants are out blogging and tweeting and Facebooking about their experiences, and so they're outing themselves and their experience. And one of the athletes that did that and got a lot of interest was Evan. So when Evan came into the study in the first of the Supernova series, he was a good athlete, but he was sort of like a top 10, top 20 athlete. And after he'd done the first of our camps, about 2.5 weeks later, he raced in our national 50K championships and he broke the Canadian record. He did an incredible PB and he really had a breakthrough. And then for the rest of that year, this was 2016, his performances just gained momentum and he ended up with a fourth place in the Rio Olympics. Might even know the story. He actually at one stage had the bronze medal, but then there was some interference that was adjudicated with him and the Japanese athlete who eventually ended up with the bronze medal, and Evan conceded very gracefully the right for him to have the bronze medal, but he'd certainly now stepped up into the big time. And so people were looking at that and thinking, gosh, what had happened to take him from that sort of solid athletic status into podium kind of placings? And there was a lot of speculation that maybe the ketogenic diet experience had given him something. Now, I've spent a lot of time with the athletes during the study and when they finished the study, trying to pick their brains about their experience. And I'm really interested to hear what their total experience is like. And certainly we knew that the athletes had experienced a lot of hardship in the first week of the diet and they'd had some problems with training capacity and particularly their ability to do the longer, higher intensity sessions. And there was some other feelings of often mental fatigue or whatever that persisted for quite a time with the diet. And when I spoke to Evan about his experience, he'd had all those kind of side effects, but he felt that the biggest benefit for him with the diet was perhaps not just the physiological change, but the psychological effort. He said that it was just so hard to be on and that it was just cost him so much to do the training and to race with the diet that he felt that he'd almost had an epiphany of just the hardship that his body was able to cope with and his ability to be able to push through. And he said it was a little bit like, he'd heard some of his female counterparts who'd had babies saying that when they came back from childbirth and then had resumed their athletic careers, they were much tougher mentally because once they'd known the pain of childbirth, it was like, well, throw anything at me in a race and I can handle it. And so that was a really interesting concept, just to feel that maybe it wasn't just a physiological process, but for him, that sort of psychological courage and depth that he'd found in himself during the early phases of the diet, at least, was perhaps where the benefit came from. And so when we looked at all the publicity that was surrounding his improvement after the first study, we decided to go back in our second study and replicate the first supernova experience, but then put some control over that period of the 2.5 weeks between finishing the ketogenic diet and then doing the race, to see if there was really a true effect, that there'd been this carryover benefit. And some people had started to talk about it on Twitter as being like doing altitude training, that, we know that when athletes go and do altitude, they go for a block of about 3 weeks, that it impairs their ability to train hard, because at altitude, with the lack of the oxygen, there's a reduction, particularly in your ability to do the high quality work. Mm-hmm. But then once you finish that training block and come back down to sea level, then the adaptations that have occurred during the altitude phase integrate with the taper, and then, within about 2.5 to 3 weeks lead to this optimised performance. So we thought, well, maybe that's a similar kind of a paradigm that we could see using ketogenic diet as a sort of an altitude training, that you'd get the adaptation and then you'd be able to recover, do the taper, freshen up, reduce the fatigue, and be able to race with the benefits of the carbohydrate support, but this legacy of what the ketogenic diet had left. And so when we did Supernova 2, we did both the replication of Supernova 1 to see whether the effects of the ketogenic diet were robust, but then was any carryover effect able to be shown that would lead to better performance in an upcoming race. And that study, which has been published this year in PLOS One, has shown, yes, our results from Supernova 1 were absolutely reproducible, but there was no evidence of any benefit that was carried over when you went back onto the high carbohydrate diet and then did a race about 3 weeks later. In fact, if anything, there was a tendency to perform not as well as if you had trained the whole way on carbohydrate-supported training. So the Dunphy effect, as we called it, couldn't be corroborated. It was probably a training camp effect, and that's the other thing that I pointed out at the time. There was a lot of interest in what had happened to Evan, but if you had a look at a lot of the other athletes that had been in Supernova 1 who'd also been on the experience of the training camp but had been on the other diets, they also had improvements in performance, because if you throw a number of elite athletes together and you make them train hard day after day and they learn from each other and they have the benefits of the scientists around them also to help them learn, then people improve their performance. And that's one of the great things about doing these kinds of projects, that everyone benefits from it. And that's one of the reasons why we are lucky that we can invite athletes, and they're desperate or at least very happy to come, and we hope we'll be able to keep on doing them. So there's a benefit just to be part of the whole process, and whether we can then add to that with the benefit of a new strategy that actually has an additive effect in terms of the physiological support, well, that's a bonus.
Yes, Crisis of Confidence Averted. It's the partial title of that brilliant study published on PLOS ONE, and I invite you all to read it carefully to have a better understanding of what Professor Louise just explained to us regarding this anecdotal proposition that prior exposure to a low-carb, high-fat diet acts like altitude training in leaving a legacy of physiological adaptations that would integrate with restoration of high carbohydrate availability and taper to produce superior race performance, which it didn't. And regarding this Dunphy effect, as you've called it, it's becoming usual to just handpick athletes to showcase them and associate them with a particular diet. And the same thing happened with the Game Changers documentary, where they handpicked a group of vegan athletes who do quite well. And we could also pick a group of good omnivorous athletes to just prove our point as well.
Look, absolutely. And the other thing that I find really annoying, or at least, we need to look at the limitations of what an observation tells us, is when you look at what an athlete does on one day and try and extrapolate that to explain their total success. And, I'm always seeing bits and pieces on Twitter about this athlete was filmed doing this, or this athlete tweeted his breakfast and it was that, and this explains everything that they do. And, I try to explain it as a little bit like the parable of the elephant and the blind men, that, and the story is, a group of blind men were shown what an elephant was, and they went up to the elephant, and one of the blind men grabbed its tail and said, "Oh, an elephant is like a rope, it's very stringy." And another one grabbed the tusk and said, an elephant is very hard and very pointy. And another one grabbed the leg. And so if we just look at one part of the elephant and think that's the whole story, we're really missing the picture of the complexity. And so, I try and remind people that just, what one athlete does on one day may not be the sum total of what they do, particularly in these days where we try and periodise things. And, often what we see athletes do is not necessarily contributing to their success. Sometimes athletes are successful in spite of some of the things we see them do.
Yes, and I think another great example of that was what happened with Chris Froome 5 years ago, I think, when he started posting low-carb meals on Twitter, and the low-carb advocates immediately started using those pictures to state that he was such a great athlete and had won so many Grand Tours because he went low-carb, and then he had to come to public and clarify and saying that, "I think the pictures I've posted on social media have been misinterpreted. I believe in low-carb, medium-carb, and high-carb," and he just had posted pictures of low-carb training days as part of a periodized approach set by Dr. James Morton. So we witnessed some desperation in almost creating these examples to prove our bias. And anyway,
well, you'd be surprised though. That meme's still doing the Twitter rounds. It's been resurrected, and even though Chris Froome and his diet team provided not just his explanation of the periodisation of his carbohydrate intake, but they also showed what he did in that Giro d'Italia race, where he had the most dramatic performance change. He was not leading until the very last stages of the tour, and on, I think it was stage 17, he mounted an incredible breakaway, and during that stage, which was quite lengthy and a lot of it was uphill, his intake was around 17 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body mass for the day. So that it was an extraordinary amount of carbohydrate, and it was done deliberately to try and provide him with the fuel that would allow him to have that sustained very high output. And so that's again, in terms of our elephant, that's not what we're recommending that athletes would do outside that situation. But, it's extraordinary that when that has become public knowledge, that we're still having to hear about Chris Froome being a low-carb devotee. So, unfortunately, fake news is fake news.
Definitely. Thank you for bringing that up. It was actually stage 19, and somehow they matched the stage number with the grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body mass that day, reaching in fact almost 19 grams per kilo of carbohydrate, which is an inhumane amount of food to be ingested, in particular the 96 grams per hour. We're talking about approximately 500 grams of carbohydrate ingested on the bike alone, with a total of 1,300 grams grams of carbohydrate on that day. But I understand this is very inconvenient to show on the low-carb Twitter spheres. And from this, we move on to the use of exogenous ketones in cycling. And this is perhaps a topic that goes a bit beyond our talk today, but I wouldn't like to finish this episode without just asking you to leave your thoughts on the use of exogenous ketones in endurance athletes, and in particular what happens when we provide exogenous ketones on top of a high carbohydrate diet and a high carbohydrate provision during a time trial, for example. And your research group has performed some research using ketone salts, showing a performance decrement, perhaps due to gastrointestinal complaints. And we had Mark Evans here on the podcast before talking about this topic, and he has highlighted some limitations we still need to overcome. But regarding this, we also know, thanks to recent research performed with elite cyclists from Professor Peter Haspel's group from the University of Leuven, that when given exogenous ketones on top of a high carbohydrate diet in a real race-like simulation, when provided 60 grams per hour of carbohydrate, there appears to be no glycogen sparing effect, but the authors highlighted a slight transient metabolic acidosis that didn't affect performance. The same group recently found that this transient effect might be rescued by providing sodium bicarbonate. So I understand that providing exogenous ketones is considerably different from undergoing a ketogenic diet protocol, but do you see any possible application for this pricey supplement in perhaps not increasing exercise performance, but rather improving recovery or enhancing training adaptations?
Look, I think this is really an evolving story, and I'm following it with all the enthrallment that you're showing here. And I know of another twist to the story that I can't reveal because it's a manuscript under review at the moment, but the story does go in twists and turns. I am interested in it, and one of the reasons that I do have some interest is that because I believe in this periodized idea that probably one state or one type of nutrition support mightn't be optimal for every aspect of performance, and that at least with the carbohydrate availability story, that it's possible to be able to change carbohydrate availability on a session-by-session basis and a day-by-day basis if we want to try and tweak it for times we want it high and times we want it low, that if there are some benefits about being in ketogenesis, that at least the supplement allows you to be able to go in and out of ketosis, so that it does provide you with an opportunity to experiment and to have low and high and fluctuating in a way that perhaps better fits the model of the carbohydrate availability story that I'm interested in. So with the ketogenic diet, you've really sort of you're either on it or you're off it. It's really difficult to try and periodize it, but the ketone supplement might be a way of adding the ability to do it in small bursts. So I think the story's unfolding. It seems to be harder than thought to find the performance benefit, and there may still be some very discrete times when it does show some benefit, but at this stage it's very difficult to say, and I'm waiting with bated breath as the story continues to unfold.
Well, you're definitely leaving me with a lot of great ideas for future episodes in the next couple of years, if Fuel the Pedal is still alive at the moment.
I'm sure we will.
Let's hope so. And Professor Louise, we can finally start wrapping up so you can finally go and have dinner peacefully with your family. And
thank you.
So I hereby give you absolute freedom to leave us with some take-home messages regarding the implementation of a ketogenic diet in endurance athletes. And perhaps I think it would be of extreme importance to just leave a message of appeasement, if you will, for anyone who still believes that the ketogenic diet is indeed the future of elite endurance sport, or that it is the only route leading to weight loss or performance enhancement in athletes or in the general population.
Yes, well, look, I'm a person that believes in horses for courses, and that with the kind of work that we do, where sustained high-intensity exercise is the key to success, whether it's throughout the race or whether it's for these key times, then we find that the carbohydrate-supported performance is the best route, at least so far, and that involves both glycogen and exogenous carbohydrate during the event. But there are lots of sports in which that is not the characteristic, and that goes all the way from the very brief high-intensity sprint-type performance right through to the ultra-endurance. And so there's different opportunities to use different nutrition support for those kinds of events. So I'm very much not a black and white person. I'm always looking for complexity and ways of being able to have specificity and individualised approaches to nutrition for different events. And so I hate it when I get backed into a corner and be put on the carbohydrate pedestal or the anti-keto group. But I think that there's room for lots of different ways of supporting sports through nutrition, and I hope that we can all find ways to get along rather than fight about it.
A fantastic message that I hope it can reach all continents and diet tribes around the globe, because it really is a much needed and important message. And in addition to this, what research developments would you like to see in the next 10 years?
Well, look, in terms of the keto diet, I'm certainly interested in seeing some longer term studies, including some cross-sectional studies, and I'd like to be part of that. But look, I've still got so many different topics of interest that I'd like to do. We're moving more now into low energy availability and trying to find ways of being able to allow athletes to modify their energy availability if they need to either do very high volume training or competition, or they're in a period where they need to change their body composition. And we're trying to find ways where they could do that more effectively with trying to minimise some of the known effects of low energy availability. That's a very practical question. But also just looking for ways in which we can try and optimise the training experience so that get that balance right between being able to train hard and being able to train smart in terms of maximising the adaptations that you're trying to achieve. So plenty of work to do. And that's before we even start talking about supplements and all the different ways that they might be able to help us both help training and competition performance. So I'll never run out of things to do.
Let's get to work then. Lots to do. And hopefully your answer can inspire more research on the topic. And if people want to keep in touch with your social media interactions, where could people find you or contact you?
Look, I am on Twitter. I have a sort of a love-hate relationship with Twitter in that I think it can be great, but I get a bit frustrated at the trolling. And otherwise, trying to set up a new form of work through Australian Catholic University, and hopefully we'll be setting up some ways in which we can share that via websites or other education and communication platforms.
Magnificent. Professor Louise, this has been a tremendous journey. Words are not enough to thank you and express my gratitude, but words are all I have at the moment. And I can only hope that you have enjoyed being here as much as I did.
I have. Thank you very much for hosting me.
It was an absolute privilege just being able to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck in your future endeavors, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
And it's done. Wow. For the first time after 33 episodes, I'm speechless. But I know one thing for sure. If someone asks me in 10 years or so, what moments will you forever remember from hosting Fuel the Pedal? Well, these past 2 episodes will be definitely a part of my answer, and the main fuel for hosting this podcast keeps on being the contact with all these amazing people and researchers who give away their time to talk about their research in the hope that it is useful to everyone listening to it. I hope you enjoyed these 2 episodes with Professor Louise Burke and that you got to see a flexible and unbiased approach to this topic. Thank you again for being on that side, listening to my ramblings, and I hope to be invading your phone very soon on another episode. Take care, boys and girls. This is Gabriel Martins, over and out. Até breve.